Although every Greek polis was different, over the course of the Archaic Age, political features and social practices like citizenship, slavery, the exclusion of women from politics, and a socio-economic hierarchy were adopted by all of them. Each polis differed in how these features and practices were developed and implemented based on how it governed itself. Most Greek city-states had one of three different types of government: an oligarchy, meaning rule by a few; a tyranny, which was a hereditary dictatorship; or democracy, meaning rule by the people. It made sense for the Spartans to adopt an oligarchic system of government since they valued military strength and discipline over everything else. The Greeks believed that the ancestors of the Spartans were Dorians who invaded the Peloponnese and defeated the original inhabitants of Laconia around 950 BC. The Spartans spoke a Doric dialect of the Greek language, but modern archaeology has not concluded that a single Dorian invasion took place in Laconia. What archaeology has concluded is that the ancestors of the Spartans first settled in 4 villages, and the 2 stronger villages dominated the others. Over time, these villages cooperated with each other and became the core of the Spartan city-state through a process the Greeks called synoecism, or the union of households. Upon becoming a singular polis, the hereditary leaders of the 2 stronger villages retained their positions and became the 2 kings of Sparta. The kingships remained hereditary, but they did not exercise power as absolute monarchs. Rather, they were the leaders of the oligarchic institutions that composed the Spartan government. The few who made up the Spartan oligarchy were the 2 kings, along with 28 other men over the age of 60, who formed the Council of Elders, or the Gerousia. In order to have some form of checks and balances, 5 annually elected overseers, called ephors, were chosen from the general male population and granted judicial authority. The ephors' main concern was upholding the rule of law and dealing out judgment and punishment when needed. This especially meant holding the members of the Gerousia, including the 2 kings, accountable. The Spartans lived in a rigid society where everyone is expected to obey the law completely in matters large and small. The rigidity of Spartan life was a reaction to being constantly surrounded by people who hated them. The Spartans had conquered most of their neighbors in Laconia and turned them into slaves, called helots. The helot population greatly outnumbered the free population of Sparta, so for this reason, Spartan men had to live as soldiers, constantly on guard and prepared for a helot rebellion. Not all the Spartans' neighbors became helots, though. There were still some self-governing communities in Laconia, but they were forced to pay taxes to Sparta and serve in the Spartan army, all while being denied Spartan citizenship. When the arable land of Laconia was no longer enough to support the Spartan population, they attacked their neighbors in Messenia. Over the course of 2 wars fought between 730 and 630 BC, the Spartans conquered Messenia, which made up 40% of the Peloponnese, and reduced their status to helots. In their private lives, helots could keep some personal possessions and freely practice their religion, as all slaves in Greece could. In public, they constantly lived under the threat of state-sanctioned violence. While Spartans could freely abuse and kill helots without any sort of legal penalty, their labor was extremely valuable to them. Since helots worked as slave farmers to produce food for the free population, Spartan men could devote all their time to military training and remain prepared to defend their polis. The Spartan way of life was dedicated first and foremost to keeping the army strong and battle-ready. Deciding how you were going to live your own life would not have been an option. Spartan boys lived at home until they were 7 years old, at which point they were sent to live in a communal barracks with other males until they were 30. During this time, they would undergo intense military education called the agoge. Those who were not cut out for military service and failed the agoge lived the rest of their life socially disgraced, publicly humiliated, and excluded from the Spartan community. Those who successfully completed the agoge then had to win admission to a group called a syssition, which was composed of around 15 members who dined together in communal meals. Each member was expected to make regular contributions of food to these meals, and failure to keep up with these contributions would result not only in expulsion from the group, but also the stripping of citizenship. The syssitia further instilled Spartan values into the young men who joined them. Even after Spartan men were married and had children of their own, they spent most of their time with this group, becoming increasingly loyal to their community over their own families. While Spartan men were renowned for their rigidity and discipline, Spartan women were renowned for their relative freedom. With their husbands constantly gone, Spartan women were able to exercise more authority over their households than other women throughout the Greek world. At the end of the day, though, Both men and women in Sparta had to put aside their individual desires for the good of the state. Above all, this meant producing children who could eventually be molded into soldiers, ready to defend their polis from any hostility it brought upon itself. A desire to avoid living like the Spartans led to the rise of tyrants in various city-states. One of the more famous episodes of tyranny took place in Corinth around 657 BC in opposition to an oligarchy led by the Bacchiad family. Under the Bacchiads, Corinth prospered as the most economically advanced polis in archaic Greece, but their violent rule made them extremely unpopular. Cypselus, a member of the social elite whose mother was a Bacchiad, overthrew the oligarchy and installed himself as a dictator by securing the support of the common people. Although Cypselus brutally suppressed his rivals, he grew the already flourishing Corinthian economy and maintained a good relationship with the masses. Upon Cypselus's death in 625 BC, his son Periander succeeded him as tyrant of Corinth. While Periander kept his father's economically expansive policies, he became increasingly unpopular due to his harsh rule. In 585 BC, Periander died and was succeeded by Psammetichus, who was quickly overthrown by the Corinthians and succeeded not by another tyrant, but by 8 magistrates and a council of 80 men. Greek tyranny was distinct in that its rulers usurped power by force, and that power then became hereditarily passed on. Since tyrants could not inherit power as legitimate kings, it was essential that they had the support of the common people, as Cypselus of Corinth did, since those were the men who would make up their armies and help them not only usurp, but remain in control. To English speakers, the word tyrant is almost always used with negative connotations, but this was not the case in archaic Greece. As we can plainly see from our episode in Corinth, tyrants could be considered good or bad depending on how they behaved as rulers. But, as the adage goes, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and it was all too often that the tyrants of Greece became increasingly tyrannical in their conduct. The Greeks traditionally attributed major historical changes, like the founding of cities, to the work of an individual hero from the distant past. The founding of Athens was attributed to the mythological hero Theseus. In addition to founding the city of Athens, Theseus is also remembered in myth for voluntarily sailing as a hostage on the city's behalf to the island of Crete, where he would defeat the Minotaur, a cannibalistic monster with the body of a man and the head of a bull, to which young men and women of Athens would be fed every 9 years in retribution for the death of King Minos of Crete's son. Like this story, other myths concerning Theseus tell of him slaying monsters and people who threaten civilized life. Because the Athenians prided themselves on bringing sophisticated civilization to the rest of the Greek world, Theseus makes for a fitting founder. Although the Athenians were not immune to the effects of the Mycenaean collapse, they did not experience the absolute catastrophe that the rest of the Greek world was forced to endure at the end of the Bronze Age. There was still a population decrease in Attica during the Dark Age, but archaeological evidence tells us that by 850 BC, the agricultural economy had revived. By 700 BC, the population had expanded rapidly, and poor men began demanding that their voices be heard in the decision-making process. When exactly a democracy formed in Athens is a gray area for scholars, but we can safely assume that by the late 7th century BC, wealthy landowners, hoplites, and poor men alike formed a government that can properly be called a democracy. While it was not a perfect system of governance by any means, the development of the Athenian political system after the Dark Age was groundbreaking. What little evidence we have indicates that all freeborn Athenian males had the right to attend a public assembly called the Ecclesia, which annually elected 9 magistrates called archons. As in modern politics, the politics of archaic Athens were dominated by the social elite, who of course wanted to be elected as archons and went through the motions of forging alliances and backstabbing one another to get what they wanted, as any true politician still does. In archaic Athens, backstabbing was not just a metaphor for betrayal, but often a violent reality. After one such political rivalry resulted in an attempted tyranny by the nobleman Chilon, an Athenian named Draco was tasked in 621 BC with passing legislation to bring back stability to the city. In one of the greatest legislative blunders of the ancient world, possibly even of all time, Draco infamously made most crimes punishable by death. It is from his name and laws that we derive the word draconian. At this time, Athens' economy was slowly deteriorating, driving a wedge between the upper and lower classes. Draco's legislation only increased the divide. Hungry farmers had to resort to drastic measures to feed their families, and by 600 BC, many poor Athenians had lost their land to their wealthy neighbors. The political climate had reached a breaking point, and a violent clash between the rich and the poor seemed inevitable. Within 25 years of Draco's legislation, the quality of life for poor Athenians was so bad that a civil war seemed to be looming on the horizon. In a desperate attempt to solve the crisis without bloodshed, in 594 BC, the Athenians gave Solon special authority to revise the laws on his own. Solon's goal in a nutshell was to balance political power in Athens between the rich and the poor. One way in which he did this was by instituting a reform that ranked male citizens into 4 categories based on their incomes. The first category was 500 measure men, or pentakosio medimnoi. These were men whose annual income was greater than or equal to 500 measures of agricultural produce. The next category was horsemen, or hippeis, who had an annual income of 300 measures. The category after that was yoked men, or zeugatai, who had an annual income of 200 measures. The final income was laborers, or thetes, who had an annual income of less than 200 measures. The higher a man's income level, the higher the governmental office he was eligible to hold, with the thetes class banned from holding any public office but still allowed to participate in the ecclesia. Keep in mind, though, the income categories which people were assigned to were not permanent. Working men could better their situations and move up the ranks. In fact, one of Solon's goals in creating the ranked income system was to encourage upward social mobility, and the absence of an income tax made it extremely easy for a determined citizen to better their lot. In addition to making political participation more accessible to the lower classes, Solon instituted several judicial reforms. Under Solon's reforms, any male citizen could bring charges of a crime against anyone they felt had victimized themselves or someone else, and more importantly, an appeal process was implemented for those who felt that they had been judged unjustly. Solon reformed the Athenian political system into something remarkable for its time and contributed to the development of greater democracy. All male citizens, regardless of their economic status, could now participate in the making of laws and the administration of justice. Solon also instituted several reforms that he hoped would improve the Athenian economy, like prohibiting exports of agricultural products except olive oil, and requiring fathers to train their sons in a trade. Despite Solon's best efforts, rivalries among the social elite once again escalated tensions and pitted the rich and poor against each other. The tension culminated in 546 BC when Pisistratus, with the help of wealthy friends and the support of the populace, installed himself as the tyrant of Athens. Like the tyrants of Corinth, Pisistratus's reign was marked by economic and cultural development. Upon his death in 527 BC, his office was inherited by his eldest son, Hippias. Hippias governed by making sure that all his friends and family members became magistrates, and even though he did allow some of his rivals to serve as archons for a time, jealousy of his supreme position and a desire to return Athens to a democracy led to the wealthy Alcmaeonid family arranging for an army of Spartans to intervene and overthrow him. After Hippias was ousted from power, the leading Alcmaeonid Cleisthenes became locked in a battle with his rival Isagoras, who became an archon in 508 BC. As Cleisthenes called for radical democratic reforms, Isagoras pulled out his enemy's own playbook and called upon the Spartan army to intervene at Athens once again, this time to oust the man they helped propel to power. Isagoras' strategy was an utter failure. The Athenian populace united against him, and in the end, it was Isagoras and the Spartan invaders, not Cleisthenes, who were expelled from the city. The Athenians' resolve and willingness to put themselves in harm's way to support Cleisthenes' vision gave him what he needed to begin building the direct democracy which Athens would become famous for. He began by radically changing the Athenian voting system. First, he made the pre-existing villages in the countryside and the neighborhoods within the city itself the constituent units, called demes. Each deme was assigned based on its geographical location to one of 30 larger divisions called thirds, or tritus. Thirds were drawn to represent the 3 territorial areas of Attica: the coast, the city, and the plains. So the coastal territory was comprised of 10 thirds, as were the plains and the city. 1/3 from each of the 3 regional categories was further assigned to one of 10 administrative divisions called tribes. Despite the connotations of the word tribe, these divisions were not linked to kinship in any way. The complex system of 10 tribes replaced the earlier system of 4 and made it to where voters in these tribes did not necessarily live near one another. This ensured that wealthy families could not so easily influence the outcomes of elections by simply exerting influence over their poor neighbors. By 500 BC, Cleisthenes had devised a system of government based on the direct participation of as many male citizens as possible. Basing his system on the demes, the majority of which were country villages, gave rural areas more of a say in the decisions of the polis. Furthermore, since wealthy landowners preferred to stay in the city, they could no longer dominate the affairs of rural areas. From the wealthiest man in the city to the poorest man in the country, every voice had an opportunity to be heard. This period in Greek history is not only marked by major changes in government, but also in literature. Poetry was the only form of Greek literature until the late Archaic period, and during this period, lyric poetry emerged and brought with it greater rhythmic diversity than was found in the epic poems of Homer and Hesiod. Lyric poems were much shorter compositions than epics, were always performed with musical accompaniment, and could be about several personal topics. The most personal of those topics would have been love, and the poet Sappho is the most famous for her descriptions of physical passions. She wrote describing her feelings for another woman. That man seems to me to be equal to the gods who is sitting opposite you, and hears you nearby speaking sweetly, and laughing delightfully, which indeed makes my heart flutter in my breast. For when I look at you even for a short time, it is no longer possible for me to speak, but it is as if my tongue is broken, and immediately a subtle fire has run over my skin. I cannot see anything with my eyes, and my ears are buzzing. A cold sweat comes over me, trembling seizes me all over. I am paler than grass, and I seem nearly to have died. Among other lyric poets was Archaic of Paros, who was renowned for his blame poetry, which was often obscene and insulting. Lyric poets also composed works based on contemporary events and politics. We have surviving poems written by Solon on such topics. Prose literature also emerged in the Archaic Age as the first philosophers, who really functioned as scientists, began writing down their ideas. These thinkers in Greece were heavily influenced by their neighbors in the Near East. Greek artists began producing reliefs like those in Assyria. Architects borrowed stone columns and ornamental designs from the Egyptians, and astronomers used the knowledge of the Babylonians to map the stars and the planets. These thinkers discovered that human beings could investigate and come to solid conclusions about the physical world and the machinations of the universe. They realized that the laws of nature are not random, nor did our world come into being simply by chance. Unfortunately, knowledge of the breakthrough discoveries they made spread slowly since there was no mass communication, and realistically, the average person did not have the time or money needed to educate themselves under one of these philosophers. This step forward in scientific discovery is thought by some to be the birth of rationalism, but in my opinion, it is extremely unfair to the ancients to say that they were by and large irrational people. They accepted that there were elements of the universe that were simply beyond their control, and they did the best that they could in trying to understand those things, even if that meant attributing them to supernatural origins. Regardless of your opinion on the relationship between science and religion, it should be noted that the early philosophers did not abandon their belief in the supernatural. They simply believed that if a position was going to be held regarding any subject, assertions needed to be backed up with evidence, and people should not expect their opinions to be considered valid if they could not be defended. To the philosophers, the gods still had their roles to play in the world, but it was ultimately humanity's job to first discover how life could be improved, and then to take the steps needed to make it happen.